couple of areas where pietism becomes particularly influential. First is the emphasis on experience in Christianity, particularly in conversion, but in general in the Christian life. And in fact, people that kind of came in contact with pietist ideas began to emphasize the importance of paying attention to the feelings in general. Christianity wasn't just about the intellect, it was also about the emotions. A second influence of pietism is what we may call the subjective term. Now, Luther had tended to emphasize the subject, the individual, as being very important to God. And we talked about how that ends up influencing people like René Descartes, who talks about, I think, therefore I am. Well, pietism helped focus that even more in the context of salvation. So the discussion of my personal salvation. And so you'll hear a lot of people talk about their personal relationship with God today. Well, part of the language of that, why that we would hear that language being used, is this influence out of pietism, even though we might be in groups that aren't directly related to pietism. We couldn't historically trace them back. A third thing coming out of pietism is the importance of charitable action and philanthropy. Now, Christians, of course, have been charitable, have done good deeds throughout the centuries. But a lot of the focus in the Reformation was on ideas, thoughts, proper doctrine. And so the pietists are kind of bringing back, reinforcing, redeveloping this concern that Christians should have for the less fortunate, those that need help. A fourth area of influence was the influence on mission work. Now, again, we've been talking about missionaries. Christians have, had missionaries, but pietism kind of changes the face of missions in encouraging this kind of emotional need for missions, not just the intellectual, the Great Commission says to do it, and so I'm going to do it. It's more of an emotional push to doing mission work. But also, pietism becomes very important, especially as we get into the 18th and 19th century, because of how strict the pietists were about moral living. Now, Christians, again, have been very concerned about morality. You look at the Sermon on the Mount. There's a lot of things on the Sermon on the Mount about how to live, right? Do not commit adultery. Don't even lust, right? You've heard it said, do not murder. I say, do not, right, hate your brother. So morality's been around in Christianity, obviously, for a long time. But what happens with the pietists is this kind of very rigid morality, and a style of morality, a focus on a subset of sins that become very important for later Christians. So prohibitions against playing cards, dancing, recreation in general for some pietists were things that Christians should avoid. And these kind of things, these particular activities viewed as sinful, stay sinful in the mindset of a lot of Christians for a long time. I remember growing up, my grandmother did not like the idea of my brother and I playing even something like solitaire or rummy or something else, right? There's no gambling involved, but it was the card playing that was a problem. So this kind of focus on a certain aspect of morality, but really almost to the point of moralism, in the sense of you have to be morally perfect, which is quite a difference than what we might see in the gospel, which is there's high standards. We should aim for those standards, but we can't be perfect. Pietism will continue to have an influence in a variety of ways, as we've already mentioned, the development of certain groups like the Methodists, but even certain other groups that we'll talk about as we get into the 18th century. Any questions about the pietists that we can address right now? Different than pietism, but also another movement developing in the 17th century was the Quakers. Again, Quakers was a name that was applied to them, not something they chose themselves. nor did they have anything to do with oatmeal. The Quakers developed from the teaching of George Fox. Fox was born in England. So everybody knows, what does the Fox say? There was a group of Quakers, and if you want it, I can send you the link, that did a parody of it called What Does George Fox Say? And so if you want to see that, let me know, I'll send you the link. But Fox was born in 1624. His family was kind of lower middle class, so he doesn't grow up in a family with a lot of means. And a lot of the family tended to have Puritan leanings, so they're influenced by a lot of Puritan things. Fox doesn't set out to be a religious leader. He is apprenticed to a cobbler, so he's working on shoes and those kind of things. But like with Philip Jacob Spinner, as he looks at some of the people he's working with, he's really kind of concerned about their moral lives and the influence that they're having on him. And so eventually he leaves being a cobbler. He feels that a lot of this is the Spirit kind of encouraging him to look for illumination. And so he begins to study Scripture, wanting to know the truth, but he also has concerns that he won't find the truth. So there's this kind of inner turmoil that Fox is experiencing. And he also becomes convinced that a lot of the Christianity in the church in England has gone astray. It's become corrupted. Ultimately, he believes he has an experience where an inner voice speaks to him. He believes the Holy Spirit speaks to him about what he should be doing. And this doctrine or this teaching is often referred to as the inner light. And so he starts speaking in a variety of situations about this inner light and the need to listen to the inner light that could be available in all humanity if people would just stop and listen. And he's doing this in public places, he's doing this in churches, any place where he can find an audience, or where an audience is already available. Well, his message is not well received. He's mocked, he's imprisoned, he's beaten, he was even charged with blasphemy. But he continues to speak. He eventually convinces a group of individuals who have been seekers. Now, we talked about seekers before, and not the way we think of the seeker today, the person trying to find a spiritual identity or trying to find the truth. The seekers, with a capital S, were an anti-clerical group of dissenters in 17th century England. They were very against the ministers of the Church of England, and in fact they often worshipped in silence as a rejection of church ritual. Felt the church ritual had gotten to too much of a focus on the practices, and so they worshipped in silence. They too also saw the English churches as corrupt. Eventually Roger Williams will become a seeker, but some of these seekers that Fox encounters will join his group, which eventually becomes known as the Society of Friends. So that's kind of the official name of the church, is the Society of Friends, sometimes the Friends Church. But because Fox would talk about trembling before the Lord, people started calling them Quakers, right? And so the idea of trembling before the Lord is where the Quaker comes from. The inner light was the chief teaching, this idea of the direct revelation of Christ to the soul. Much like the seekers, the Quakers, the Friends, also tended to be anti-clerical. Fox condemned ministers who worked for a salary. They're not true shepherds. Instead, they are hired people, often referring to them as priests. Kind of an anti-Catholic jab, right? You're Catholic if you're a paid minister. They were also very anti-liturgical, thinking that a lot of the rituals of Christianity hindered the freedom of the Spirit. So having an order of worship, for example, was a hindrance to the freedom of the Spirit. Even today, some Friends churches have no program services. And so the people sit there in silence and wait until the Spirit moves somebody to speak. And so that's a part of this as well. Even in those early years, women had very similar rights to men, meaning that they could speak in the assemblies if they felt the Spirit moved them. There was also a rejection of any notion of sacraments. We talked about how a lot of Protestants rejected the 7, went to 2. The Quakers rejected all of them. They also ended up in trouble because they rejected a lot of the social norms. One of them being like when you would pass somebody that was your better, right, somebody that's in the upper classes, a lord or noble, you were to make some sort of sign of respect, bow to them, take off your cap. Quakers refused to do that, and so they often were a problem for social order as well, which led to persecution, laws, fines, imprisonment. By the middle of the 1650s, a lot of Quakers started traveling to Massachusetts, thinking that they would have more freedoms in the New World, in the colonies. If they were recognized as Quakers, though, they often ended up being imprisoned and fined in Massachusetts. So the Puritans come for religious freedom, but deny that to other groups. In the late 1650s, several Quakers were hanged for being Quakers, which causes Charles II, who is absolutely no friend of Puritans, to order all Quakers be sent to England for trial. I mean, he doesn't particularly like the Quakers either. He just doesn't like the fact that Puritans are hanging them. Fox himself visits New England in the 1670s. The colony of Rhode Island had offered some freedoms for Friends, and so that's one of the places he travels to. But even Roger Williams had problems with the Quaker teachings. He had been one of those who fell afoul of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, had been banished, started Rhode Island under religious toleration, yet it's one of those things. We have religious toleration for some people, but in this case, not so much George Fox. One of the most famous Quakers in American history, especially American religious history, was William Penn. Growing up in Pennsylvania, I heard a lot about William Penn. He was the son of Admiral William Penn, who had been famous for conquering Jamaica under Oliver Cromwell, who, if you remember, was Lord Protector during that aftermath of the English Civil War. But Admiral Penn was also a friend of the restored monarch Charles II, so he traveled in some pretty powerful circles. William Penn, not his father, decides to become a Puritan, which upsets his father. He goes to France, becomes influenced by the Huguenots, and in 1667 converts to Quakerism, which further frustrates his father. Because of being a Quaker, the younger Penn was imprisoned for a time, but is later released. He too runs in some rather prominent circles, becomes friends to both Charles II and James II, befriends John Locke and some other important political philosophers. He too begins writing, encouraging religious tolerance, really trying to write some things to defend Quakers. Eventually, he is able to get a tract of land west of Delaware in the North American colonies because Charles II owed him 16,000 pounds. I'm not sure why Charles II owed him that much money, but instead of paying him the money, he gives him some land. Penn would travel there in 1682 with the purpose of founding a colony with complete religious freedom. The colony is sometimes referred to as Penn's Woods or Pennsylvania. Even though Charles II had given Penn the land to pay off the debt, Penn decides he's still going to buy the land from the Indians and doesn't feel that the crown has the right to give this land away because it belongs to the Indians. In the first year, establishes the city of brotherly love of Philadelphia. Of course, many Quakers immigrate to Pennsylvania. Eventually, though, other groups start immigrating there as well. Scots-Irish Presbyterians, Germans, some of them Mennonites, some of them not. There's a large group of Mennonite and Amish, which is a break-off of the Mennonite in Pennsylvania. And eventually the Quakers are gradually removed from power in the colony. We'll see Quakers a couple of other times throughout the rest of the class, but it's not a group that really gets a sizable number of people, though at various times become important kind of tangentially. So, for example, they're very important in the abolition of slavery, especially in England. Richard Nixon, President Richard Nixon, grew up a Quaker, and so there's a couple different places where Quakers will enter the story as we think about it. Any questions about Quakers?